What if the very thing you've been calling grace is actually the reason your faith feels so weak right now? Not something obvious, not something dramatic, but something quiet. Something you've said so many times it started to feel true. What if that phrase you keep returning to, God understands, has slowly, almost without you noticing, become the reason nothing in your life is really changing? Think about that for a moment. Not quickly, not defensively, just honestly. Because most people don't wake up one day and decide to walk away from God. That's not how it usually happens. It's slower than that, quieter than that. It happens in small thoughts, small justifications, small decisions that don't feel dangerous at the time. And somewhere along the way, a sentence like, God understands me, stops being something comforting and starts becoming something you lean on to stay exactly where you are. You don't even mean for it to happen. You're not trying to rebel. You're not trying to drift. In fact, if someone asked you, you'd probably still say you believe. You'd say you love God. You'd say your faith matters to you. And maybe it does. But something feels different now, doesn't it? Something feels weaker, quieter, less alive than it used to be. You still pray sometimes, but it doesn't feel the same. You still think about God, but it feels distant, like there's space between you, and you can't quite explain why. So you tell yourself what feels reasonable. God knows my heart. He understands what I'm going through. He knows I'm trying. And again, those words sound right. They sound spiritual. They sound comforting. But what if, somewhere along the way, they stopped being truth and started becoming an excuse? Not a loud excuse, not something you would ever admit out loud, but a quiet one. The kind that lets you stay in patterns you once felt convicted about. The kind that helps you explain things away instead of confronting them. The kind that slowly lowers the standard until you don't even notice how far things have shifted. Because here's what makes this so difficult to see. Nothing feels extreme. There's no major collapse, no sudden turning point, just a slow settling, a quiet adjustment, a life that still looks okay on the outside, but doesn't feel as strong on the inside. And maybe that's where you are right now. Not lost, not gone, but not as close as you once were. Not as sensitive, not as responsive, not as alive in your faith as you remember being. And instead of asking hard questions, it's easier to say, God understands. It's easier to believe that nothing really needs to change. It's easier to stay where things are familiar. But what if that's the problem? What if the comfort you've been holding on to is actually the thing keeping you stuck? What if the words that once brought you peace have quietly become something else entirely? Not truth, but permission. Permission to delay, permission to ignore, permission to remain the same. And the hardest part is this: you didn't even notice when it happened. It didn't feel like a decision. It felt like life. It felt like getting tired, getting busy, getting used to things the way they are. And over time, that edge you once had, that sensitivity, that awareness, that conviction, it didn't disappear overnight. It just softened until one day you realized you're still here, still believing, but something inside you doesn't feel as strong as it used to, and you can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. So let me ask you again, not to accuse you, not to pressure you, but to wake something up inside you. What if saying God understands has slowly become your way of staying the same? What if the thing you've trusted to comfort you is quietly weakening you? And what if, right now, this moment, is the first time you've really stopped to question it? Don't rush past that feeling. Don't push it away, because sometimes the beginning of real change doesn't come with answers. It comes with a question you can't ignore anymore. Maybe you didn't walk away from God, not in the way people usually describe it. There wasn't a moment where you said, "I'm done." There wasn't a clear break, no dramatic decision, no turning point where everything changed overnight. If anything, it felt much quieter than that. You're still here. You still believe. You still think about God, maybe more often than people around you realize. And if someone asked you directly, you wouldn't hesitate to say your faith still matters to you, because it does. At least in your heart, it does. But something feels different now. Not completely broken, just off. Like something that used to be clear has become a little blurry. You still pray, but not the way you used to. There was a time when prayer felt natural. You didn't have to force it. You didn't have to think about it. You would just talk in the car before going to sleep. Early in the morning, before the day got busy. It wasn't always long. It wasn't always perfect, but it was real. Now sometimes you start praying and your mind drifts. You say a few words and then stop. Not because you don't care, but because something feels distant, like you're speaking, but not really connecting, and you notice it. You don't always admit it out loud, but you notice it. The same thing happens when you open your Bible. You still open it sometimes, maybe out of habit, maybe because you feel like you should. You read a few verses, but it doesn't land the way it used to. It doesn't stay with you. You close it and move on with your day. And somewhere deep down, you feel that quiet question rising again. What changed? Because you remember when it felt different. You remember when something in you responded. When conviction wasn't something you avoided, it was something you respected, even when it was uncomfortable, especially when it was uncomfortable. There was a time when you would feel that inner nudge, that quiet voice saying, "This isn't right." And you would stop. Not perfectly, not every time, but you would respond. You cared. Now it's easier to ignore. Not because you've become a bad person, not because you've stopped believing, but because something in you has gotten used to it, used to the compromises, used to the small things you once questioned, used to explaining things in a way that makes them easier to live with. And it didn't happen all at once. It never does. It started small. A thought you didn't challenge, a habit you didn't confront, a decision you told yourself wasn't that serious. And life kept moving. Work, family, responsibilities, the normal rhythm of everyday life. You wake up, go through your routine, handle what needs to be handled, deal with people, deal with stress, deal with responsibilities. And in the middle of all that, it becomes easy to push certain things aside. not because they don't matter, but because they don't feel urgent. And slowly, very slowly, what once felt important becomes optional. You still believe in God, but you stop letting Him correct you. That's the part no one talks about. You didn't walk away from Him. You just stop letting Him speak into certain areas of your life. Stop letting His word challenge you. Stop letting conviction go deep. You hear things, but you don't sit with them. You feel something, but you move past it quickly. You sense that inner pull, and instead of responding, you explain it away. It's not that big of a deal. I'll deal with it later. God understands. And again, that phrase, it shows up quietly, almost automatically, not as rebellion, but as reassurance. Something you tell yourself to feel at peace. And for a moment, it works. It settles the tension. It calms the discomfort. It gives you permission to move on. But the truth is, it doesn't actually fix anything. It just helps you avoid it. And over time, that pattern becomes normal. You still go through the motions. You still live your life. You still carry your faith with you. But something inside you starts to feel quieter, less responsive, less alive. And it's hard to explain, because on the outside, everything looks fine. You're still functioning, still responsible, still showing up for the people in your life. But internally, there's a difference, a subtle distance, a quiet disconnect. And maybe you've tried to ignore it. Maybe you've told yourself it's just a season, that it'll pass, that things will feel normal again eventually. But deep down, you know something shifted. You know this isn't how it used to feel. And maybe, just maybe, you've been avoiding looking at it too closely. Because if you slow down long enough to really face it, you might have to admit something you've been trying not to say. That you didn't walk away from God. You just stopped letting Him lead, stopped letting Him correct, stopped letting Him interrupt your comfort. And instead, you learned how to stay close enough to feel okay, but distant enough to stay the same. And that place, it's quiet, it's subtle, but it's real. And if you're honest, you can feel it. Let's slow down for a moment, not to rush past what you felt, but to finally put words to it. Because what you've been experiencing, what you've been sensing, but maybe couldn't fully explain, it has a source. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. There's a thought, simple, quiet, almost harmless, that has been sitting underneath everything. Not loud, not obvious, but steady, consistent, familiar. And it sounds like this: God understands my weakness, so He doesn't really expect me to change. At first, that sounds comforting. It sounds compassionate. It sounds like something you would hear in a place of grace. And part of it is true. God does understand your weakness completely. He understands your struggles better than anyone. He understands the patterns you've been fighting. He understands the things you don't talk about. He understands the battles that happen inside your mind when no one else is around. There's nothing about you that confuses him. Nothing about your life that surprises him. Nothing about your struggle that makes him step back and say, I didn't see that coming. He understands fully, deeply, without hesitation. But here's where the shift happens. Somewhere along the way, that truth gets slightly twisted, not replaced, just adjusted. And that adjustment is where the problem begins. Because the truth says, God understands your weakness, so he calls you higher. But the lie quietly changes it to, God understands your weakness, so he's okay with you staying there. And that difference, even though it seems small, changes everything. Because one leads you forward, the other keeps you stuck. One invites growth, the other protects comfort. One brings transformation, the other slowly removes the urgency to change. And the hardest part is this: the lie doesn't feel like a lie. It feels reasonable. It feels kind. It feels like something you can rest in. But if you look closely, it doesn't actually move you anywhere. It just helps you stay where you are. And over time, that becomes dangerous. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly. Because if you begin to believe that change is not expected, then effort fades. If you begin to believe that nothing really needs to shift, then conviction loses its voice. If you begin to believe that God is simply understanding without also being transformative, then faith becomes passive. And passive faith doesn't grow. It settles. It adjusts. It adapts to whatever feels easiest in the moment. And that's where many people find themselves. Not rejecting God, not denying truth, but quietly living in a version of faith that requires very little from them.
And again, it doesn't feel wrong at first. It feels manageable. It feels balanced. It feels like you've found a way to live your life without feeling constant tension. But that tension, it had a purpose. It was never there to punish you. It was there to guide you, to keep you aware, to remind you that something inside you was still alive, still responsive, still moving towards something better. And when that tension disappears, when everything starts to feel fine all the time, you have to ask yourself, did things really get better? Or did I just get used to where I am? Because there's a difference, a real one. And this is where we need to be honest. Grace was never permission to remain the same. It was power to become different. Let that settle. Grace is not God saying, it's okay, stay there. Grace is God saying, I see where you are, and I'm going to help you move forward. Grace doesn't lower the standard. It gives you the strength to rise to it. Grace doesn't remove the call. It empowers your response to it. And when grace is misunderstood, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a covering instead of a catalyst. It becomes something you hide behind instead of something that pushes you forward. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to build a life around that misunderstanding. You learn how to stay comfortable. You learn how to manage the tension instead of responding to it.
You learn how to live in a way that feels acceptable without ever really being transformed. And again, this is not about condemnation. This is not about pointing fingers or making you feel guilty. This is about clarity. Because you can't move forward if you're still believing something that's holding you in place. And the truth is simple, even if it's uncomfortable. God's understanding was never meant to replace your response. It was meant to lead you into it. His patience was never meant to make you passive. It was meant to give you time to change. His grace was never meant to make you comfortable in compromise. It was meant to pull you out of it. And if you've been living in that space, that place where things feel okay, but not alive, where nothing feels urgent, but something feels off, then this might be the moment where everything becomes clear. Not heavy, not overwhelming, just clear. Because once you see the difference between truth and lie, you start to recognize the pattern. You start to see how certain thoughts have shaped your decisions, how certain beliefs have influenced your habits, how certain phrases, repeated over time, have quietly built a mindset that keeps you from moving. And that awareness, it doesn't condemn you, it frees you. Because now you know. Now you can see it. Now you can stop calling something truth when it's actually been holding you back. And that's where everything begins to shift. Not because you suddenly become perfect, but because you stop believing the lie that told you you didn't need to change. Let me tell you a story. Not about someone far away, not about a person you'll never meet, but about someone who might feel familiar. Someone whose life, if you look closely, might remind you of parts of your own. There was a time when their faith felt alive, not perfect, not flawless, but real. They didn't have all the answers, but they had something deeper than that, a sense of closeness, a sense that God was near. They would wake up in the morning, sometimes before the house got noisy, before the phone started ringing, before responsibilities began stacking up, and they would sit quietly, sometimes with a cup of coffee in their hand, sometimes just in silence, and they would pray. Not long, polished prayers, just honest ones, simple words, real thoughts. Sometimes even just sitting there, thinking about God, felt enough. There was a softness in their heart back then, a sensitivity. They noticed things. When something felt off, they didn't ignore it. When conviction came, they didn't argue with it. It didn't always feel comfortable, but they respected it. They responded, even in small ways. If something didn't feel right, they would pause, think about it, adjust, try again. There was movement, not dramatic, but steady. And over time, that kind of life builds something. It builds strength. It builds clarity. It builds a kind of quiet confidence that you're walking in the right direction. But then life happened. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once, just gradually. Responsibilities grew. Work got heavier. Family needed more. Time felt shorter. Energy felt thinner. And little by little, things began to shift. Not intentionally, not as a decision, just slowly. They still believed. That never changed. They still thought about God, still prayed sometimes, but not like before, not with the same attention, not with the same depth. What used to be a daily habit became something occasional. What used to feel natural started to feel like effort. And when something feels like effort, it's easy to delay it. I'll do it later. Tomorrow will be better. I'm just tired today. And those thoughts, they sound harmless, reasonable even, but they begin to create distance, not suddenly, quietly. And then came the small compromises. Nothing big, nothing that would make anyone stop and say, something's wrong. Just small things. Things they once would have questioned, now they explained. Things they once would have paused for, now they moved past quickly. And when that small sense of conviction showed up, they noticed it. Of course they did. But instead of stopping, they softened it. It's not that serious. Everyone deals with this. I'm not perfect. And again, that phrase, God understands. And it felt right. It felt comforting. It felt like a way to keep going without feeling guilty. So they kept going. And nothing fell apart. That's the part that makes this so difficult to recognize. There was no collapse, no crisis. Life kept moving. They still showed up to work, still took care of responsibilities, still laughed, still talked, still lived. On the outside, everything looked fine. But inside, something was changing, very slowly. So slowly, it was almost impossible to notice in the moment. That sensitivity they once had, it didn't disappear, it just became quieter. That quick response to conviction, it didn't stop, it just became delayed. That awareness of right and wrong, it didn't vanish, it just became easier to work around. And over time, those small shifts added up. They didn't wake up one day far from God. They drifted there quietly, step by step, decision by decision, moment by moment, until one day something felt different. Not broken, just distant. Like a relationship that hasn't ended, but hasn't been nurtured either. You still recognize it, but it doesn't feel the same. And maybe they tried to fix it. Maybe there were moments where they said, I need to get back on track. Moments where they felt a little more aware, a little more motivated. But those moments didn't last because the pattern had already been set. The drift had already become normal. And it's hard to break something that doesn't feel urgent. So they continued, living in that quiet middle space, not fully disconnected, but not fully engaged, not far gone, but not where they used to be. And the hardest part, they could still say all the right things, still believe all the right ideas, still carry the language of faith, but something inside was no longer responding the same way. And that's how it happens. Not through rebellion, not through one big decision, but through a series of small moments where nothing seems serious enough to change, until those small moments become a pattern, and that pattern becomes your normal. And before you even realize it, you're living a life that feels okay on the surface, but quietly, you've drifted somewhere you never intended to go. Not lost, not gone, but not as close as you once were. And if you're honest, you can feel it. And then there comes a moment, not always loud, not always dramatic. Sometimes it doesn't even look like a breaking point at all. On the outside, everything can still seem normal. You wake up, you go about your day, you handle your responsibilities, you smile when you're supposed to smile, you respond when people talk to you. Nothing appears to be falling apart, but deep inside, something feels off. Not completely gone, not destroyed, just weakened. Like a muscle that hasn't been used in a long time. You remember what it used to feel like. You remember the strength, the clarity, the sense of direction. But now it feels harder, heavier, more distant. And maybe you can't even explain it clearly. You just know something isn't the same. Faith, for example, you still have it. You haven't walked away from it. You still believe, but it doesn't move you the way it used to. It doesn't carry the same weight. You hear the same truths you once held tightly, but they don't land the same way anymore. It's not that they're untrue. It's that something inside of you has become less responsive. And prayer becomes something you still do, but differently. You say the words, you go through the motions, but it feels routine, like something familiar but no longer alive. You sit there, maybe at the end of a long day, tired, distracted, your mind pulling in different directions, and you try to pray. But your heart isn't fully there. You say what you think you should say, you repeat what you've said before, and when you finish, there's this quiet feeling. Not peace, not relief, just emptiness. And you wonder, even if you don't say it out loud, what happened? How did it get like this? And identity, that starts to shift too. Not in obvious ways, but subtly, quietly. You still see yourself as someone who believes, but at the same time, there are parts of your life that don't line up with that anymore. And instead of confronting that tension, you learn to live with it, to carry both at the same time, to be one person in your thoughts and another in your habits. And after a while, it doesn't even feel strange anymore. It just feels normal. And that's the danger. Not the fall, not the failure, but the comfort. The comfort of living in something you once would have resisted. The comfort of staying where you once would have fought to leave. Because once comfort settles in, change feels unnecessary. Urgency disappears. And without urgency, nothing moves. That's why this place, this quiet middle ground, is more dangerous than it looks. Because it doesn't alarm you. It doesn't scare you. It doesn't demand your attention. It lets you stay exactly where you are, and you begin to adjust your thinking to match it. You begin to tell yourself things like, it's not that bad. I've been through worse. At least I still believe. And all of that sounds reasonable until you realize what's actually happening. You're no longer measuring your life by truth. You're measuring it by comfort. And comfort can be very deceptive because it doesn't always mean you're okay. Sometimes it just means you've stopped resisting what's hurting you. And here's the part that's hardest to admit. The most dangerous place is not rebellion. It's comfort inside compromise. Rebellion is obvious, it's loud, it's clear. When someone walks away completely, when they reject everything, when they turn their back without hesitation, you can see it, you can name it, you can respond to it. But comfort inside compromise, that's quiet, that's subtle. That's the place where you still think you're okay, while slowly losing the very thing that once kept you grounded. It's where your faith becomes something you carry, but no longer something that shapes you. It's where your beliefs stay the same, but your life no longer reflects them. And over time, that disconnect begins to wear you down. Not all at once, but little by little. You feel less confident in your prayers, less certain in your direction, less aware of God's presence in your daily life. And eventually, you stop expecting anything to change. You stop believing that things can be different. You stop reaching for something deeper because you've adjusted to staying where you are. And that's the breaking point. Not when everything collapses, but when you quietly settle. When you accept a version of your life that is far below what you once knew was possible. When you stop fighting for clarity, stop pursuing growth, stop responding to that inner voice that once guided you, and instead, you just continue day after day, routine after routine, comfortable but not alive, functional but not transformed. And if you sit with that long enough, if you're honest with yourself, you can feel it, that quiet tension, that sense that something deeper is missing. Not because God moved away, but because over time, you slowly stopped moving toward Him. And the hardest truth, it didn't happen all at once. It happened in small, quiet moments that didn't feel important at the time, but together they changed everything. But here is where everything can begin to change. Not through pressure, not through fear, not through trying harder in your own strength, but through truth. A kind of truth that doesn't crush you, but meets you right where you are. Because after everything we've talked about, the drifting, the quiet compromises, the distance you can feel but can't always explain, there is something you need to hear clearly. God does understand your struggle. He really does. He sees the parts of your life that no one else sees. He knows the patterns you've been caught in. He understands how tired you felt, how many times you've tried to change and didn't follow through, how easy it became to just accept things the way they are. He understands all of that. But that understanding was never meant to leave you where you are. It was never meant to become a reason to stay stuck. It was never meant to quietly whisper, "It's okay, just remain the same." No, His understanding carries something deeper than that. It carries intention. It carries purpose. It carries an invitation. Because the truth is, God understands your struggle, but He loves you too much to leave you in it. And that might feel uncomfortable at first, because part of you has grown used to the idea that understanding means acceptance without change. But real love doesn't work that way. Think about it in simple, everyday terms. If you saw someone you care about, someone close to you, slowly hurting themselves, slowly drifting into something that was taking away their strength, their clarity, their peace, you wouldn't just stand there and say, "I understand." You would care too much for that. You would want something better for them. You would gently call them out of it, not to shame them, not to condemn them, but because you see what they might not be seeing anymore. And in a much deeper, more perfect way, that's exactly how God sees you. He doesn't look at your life and ignore what's hurting you. He doesn't pretend that compromise is harmless. He doesn't soften truth just to make you feel temporarily comfortable. Because his goal isn't your comfort. His goal is your restoration. His goal is your freedom. And freedom doesn't come from pretending nothing is wrong. It comes from facing what is real and walking out of it with his help. That's why grace exists. Not to excuse, but to empower. Not to say, stay where you are, but to say, you don't have to stay there. And this is where something shifts. Because maybe for a long time, you've been defining yourself by your weakness. Quietly, without even realizing it. You've been thinking things like, this is just who I am. This is something I'll probably always struggle with. I've tried before. It didn't last. And over time, those thoughts start to feel true. Not because they actually are, but because you've lived with them long enough. But your identity was never meant to be built on your struggles. It was never meant to be defined by the things you haven't overcome yet. You are not your patterns. You are not your habits. You are not your failures. You are someone who has been called, someone who has been seen, someone who has been invited into something more. And yes, the process of change is real. It's not instant. It's not always easy. There are days where you take a step forward and then a step back. There are moments where you feel strong and moments where you feel like you're starting over again. But that doesn't mean you're stuck. That doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means you're in the process. And faith, real faith, is not about getting everything right. It's not about reaching some perfect version of yourself overnight. It's about surrender, again and again. It's about choosing in small but honest ways to turn back toward God, even when you feel weak, even when you feel uncertain, even when you don't fully trust yourself yet, because the power of change was never meant to come from you alone. That's where so many people get discouraged. They think they have to fix everything first. They think they need to become stronger, more disciplined, more consistent before they can really move forward. But that's not how it works. You don't clean yourself up first and then come closer. You come closer, and that's where the change begins. You bring the weakness with you. You bring the inconsistency with you. You bring the parts of your life that don't make sense yet, and you place them in His hands. And slowly, something begins to shift. Not all at once, but in ways that are real. You start to notice things again. That sensitivity you thought you lost, it starts to return. That awareness of what's right, it becomes clearer. That desire to change, it feels stronger. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped running from it. And maybe right now, you're sitting in that quiet space, somewhere between where you used to be and where you want to be. Not completely lost, but not fully alive either. And you're wondering if it's possible to come back, if it's possible to feel that clarity again, to feel that closeness again? And the answer is yes. But not through pretending everything is fine, and not through carrying guilt without direction. The way back begins with honesty. Simple, quiet, unfiltered honesty. The kind where you stop explaining things away. Stop renaming things to make them easier to live with. And just say, this isn't where I want to stay. Not with fear, not with shame, but with clarity. Because the moment you stop justifying is the moment something begins to open. And in that moment, God is not distant. He's not waiting to push you away. He's not looking for a reason to reject you. He's right there, ready. Not just to understand your struggle, but to lead you out of it, step by step, day by day. Not perfectly, but genuinely. And that's where hope begins again. Not in pretending you've already changed, but in realizing that you don't have to stay the same. So what do you actually do now? Not in theory, not in ideas, but in real life, when this video ends and you go back to your normal routine. Because it's one thing to feel something stir inside you. It's another thing to respond to it. And if you're honest, you've probably had moments like this before. Moments where something became clear. Moments where you felt that quiet pull to change. Moments where you told yourself, this needs to be different. But then life kept moving. The feeling faded and nothing really changed. So this time, let's make it simple. Not overwhelming, not complicated, just real. Because real change rarely begins with big, dramatic moves. It begins in small, honest decisions. The kind that don't always feel powerful in the moment, but slowly reshape everything. Let's walk through this carefully, not rushed, step by step. The first thing is something that sounds simple, but is often the hardest to do. Call sin what it is, not what you've been calling it. Not what makes it easier to live with, but what it actually is. Because over time, we get used to softening things. We rename them. We say, it's just a struggle, or it's part of my personality, or this is just how I cope. And those words, they feel lighter. They feel easier to carry. But they also keep you stuck because you can't walk away from something that you're not being honest about. And this isn't about beating yourself up. It's not about shame. It's not about standing there and condemning yourself. It's about clarity. It's about looking at something directly and saying, this is not helping me. This is not who I want to be. This is not leading me anywhere good. That kind of honesty, it creates space for change. Without it, nothing moves. So don't rush past that step. Sit with it. Be real about it, even if it feels uncomfortable, because that discomfort is often the beginning of something better. The second step is just as important. Invite conviction back into your life. Not fear, not pressure, but conviction. That quiet inner voice, the one you used to notice more clearly. the one that would pause you, the one that would gently say, "Don't ignore this." Over time, that voice can become easier to overlook, not because it's gone, but because you've learned how to move past it quickly. You've learned how to explain it away. You've learned how to keep going without stopping. But you can choose differently now. You can actually ask for that awareness to return in a simple, honest way. Something like, "God, don't let me get comfortable here." That's it. No long speech, no perfect words, just the real request. Because comfort in the wrong place is what keeps people stuck the longest. And when you invite conviction back in, you're not asking to feel worse. You're asking to see clearly again, to feel again, to notice again. And that matters more than you think, because awareness is what guides your next step. Which brings us to the third thing. Choose one act of obedience. Not everything, not your whole life at once, just one. Because this is where many people get overwhelmed. They feel like if they're going to change, they have to fix everything immediately. Every habit, every pattern, every area. And when that feels too big, they do nothing. So don't do that. Don't try to change your entire life overnight. Just choose one thing, one area where you already know this needs to shift, and take one real step. It might be small, it might not feel impressive, it might not look like much to anyone else, but it matters, because movement, even small movement, breaks the cycle. Maybe it's something as simple as stopping something you've been allowing. Maybe it's being honest about something you've been avoiding. Maybe it's returning to a habit you've let go of. Time with God, time in silence, time in reflection. Whatever it is, make it real. Not in your thoughts, not in your intentions, but in your actions. Because here's something you need to understand. Freedom doesn't begin with feelings. It begins with a decision. You don't wait until you feel ready. You don't wait until you feel strong. You don't wait until everything makes sense. You decide, and then you move. And as you move, things begin to shift. Not instantly, not perfectly, but genuinely. Because every real step you take changes something inside you. It rebuilds trust. It restores clarity. It reminds you that you're not stuck, that you're not powerless, that change is actually possible. And maybe right now you're thinking, what if I try and it doesn't last? That's a real question, a fair one. But here's the truth. This isn't about proving something. It's not about getting it perfect. It's about starting again and again and again. Each time with a little more awareness, a little more honesty, a little more willingness. Because this process, it's not about becoming flawless. It's about becoming responsive. Learning to respond when something inside you says, pay attention. Don't ignore this. Move in a different direction. And the more you respond, the clearer that voice becomes. The stronger your direction becomes. The more natural it feels to walk forward instead of staying stuck. So don't overcomplicate this. Don't turn it into something heavy. Just be real. Call things what they are. Invite awareness back. Take one step. That's it. And trust that even something small, when it's honest, can begin to change more than you expected. So here you are. After everything we've walked through together, the questions, the quiet realizations, the parts that may have been a little uncomfortable to hear, but also a little too familiar to ignore. And maybe right now you're sitting in a kind of silence, not empty, but thoughtful, like something inside you has slowed down just enough to actually notice what's been going on beneath the surface. Not rushed, not distracted, just aware. And in that awareness, there's a choice. Not a loud, dramatic decision, not something that requires you to have everything figured out. Just a quiet moment of honesty. Because if you look back at everything we've talked about, it really comes down to this. There was a lie, a subtle one that didn't sound harmful at first. God understands. And that part is true. But somewhere along the way, that truth got twisted. It became something else, something softer, something easier, something that allowed you to stay where you were without feeling the need to move. And maybe you didn't even notice when that shift happened. It didn't feel like a decision. It felt like a relief, like a way to keep going without having to deal with the harder parts. But slowly, quietly, that lie started to take something from you. Not all at once, not in obvious ways, but piece by piece. It took some of your clarity, some of your sensitivity, some of that quiet confidence you used to carry in your faith, until one day you realized something felt different. Not broken, but not the same either. And now here you are, not because everything has fallen apart, but because something inside you is ready to be honest again. And that matters more than you think. Because the lie may have come close, but it doesn't get the final word. It almost took your faith, but it doesn't have to take your future. You're not as far gone as you might feel. You're not beyond change. You're not stuck in this place permanently. In fact, you're closer than you think, closer than you've been in a long time. Not because you've done everything right, but because you're willing to see clearly again. And sometimes that's where everything begins. Not with perfection, but with honesty. Simple, quiet honesty. The kind where you stop pretending. Stop explaining things away. Stop telling yourself it's fine when deep down you know it isn't. And instead, you just acknowledge it. Without fear, without shame, just truth. This isn't where I want to stay. And the moment you say that, even quietly, even imperfectly, something shifts. Because you're no longer holding on to the lie, you're letting it go. And when you let it go, you make room for something else, something real, something that actually leads you forward. And here's what you need to hear, maybe more than anything else right now. You're not one big step away from God. You're one honest moment away. That's it. Not a perfect plan, not a dramatic change, just a real moment. A moment where you stop running, stop hiding behind explanations, stop softening what you already know, and just come as you are. Because God isn't standing at a distance, waiting for you to fix everything first. He's not watching you from far away, measuring how well you've performed. He's right there, present, ready, not to excuse what's hurting you, but to lead you out of it, gently, patiently, step by step. And maybe right now, this is that moment for you. Not something to rush, not something to force, just something to respond to in your own way, in your own words, even if it's quiet, even if it's simple, something like this: God, open my eyes, not just to see what I've been avoiding, but to see clearly again, to see truth without twisting it, to see my life without softening it. And not just that, show me the way out, not all at once, not everything at the same time, just the next step, the next right step, because that's all you really need. You don't need the whole picture. You don't need to figure out every detail. You just need enough clarity to take one step forward, and then another, and then another. And over time, those small steps begin to rebuild something real, something steady, something stronger than what you had before. Not because it's perfect, but because it's honest, because it's rooted in truth, and not in something that only feels good for a moment. So don't leave this moment too quickly. Don't rush back into distraction. Don't push this feeling aside. Sit with it just a little longer. Let it settle. Let it speak. Because moments like this, they don't come around by accident. They come when something inside you is ready, ready to see, ready to change, ready to move forward again. And if that's where you are right now, then you're not behind, you're not late, you're right on time, right at the place where things can begin again. And as you move forward from here, remember this: God doesn't excuse what's hurting you. He heals it, but only if you let Him.